Chapter 2. A Clay Pot. The next day I walked to Hunter Island, and, as usual, Joe found me before I found him. We passed the early hours of the morning drinking a tea that he had made from the berries of the sumac plant. Each fall he would gather the berries when they turned as red as the sundown. For the rest of the season he boiled these with the broad leaves of green seaweed to make a healthful drink. It was this beverage, he claimed, that prevented colds, arthritis, coughs, and other illnesses. It didn't taste awfully good. After passing the early part of the warm, sunny morning at these amenities, I told Joe I was ready to start the making of my pot. He seemed quite surprised and asked if the Great Spirit had already sent instructions to my hands about the making of a thing so important as a vessel to use in the cooking of his game. He asked me if the maker himself had told me to start on the path that would end with a new clay pot. I was still a small bit dubious, but I answered that he had. Two trees told me that to start the pot before the sanction of Teachee Manitou would be very bad medicine. Since my interpretation of medicine was the bad-tasting stuff that comes out of brown bottles when I got a fever, I asked him to explain. He gave his concept to me, and I have preferred it to mine ever since. At the beginning, when the Great Spirit was just finishing the making of all things, he saw that he still had some power left over. This was power that he had not needed to use in making the water and land, or the mountains and trees, or any of the living things. In order that this power should not be let loose to be lost, or fall into the hands of Manitou, the evil one, he saw that he must find some use for it. He sat down for a time to think and smoked his pipe. Seeing the clouds that he made, he thought that they would be good to make shade for his new creations, and he told them to continue in the skies forever. So that they could do this, he gave each of them some of the leftover power. Having made the clouds and given them some of his power, he decided to share the rest among all the other creations of the world in proportion to their rank in the overall order of things. He shared it with the rocks and animals, trees, birds, humans, and all other things. It was in this way that all things came to have power or medicine. If we can be very skillful or lucky, when we make something from any of these, we may use materials that are more full of good medicine than others. In this way we can end up with a finished product that will be very full of medicine for its intended use. Since my clay pot would be an important item, it was necessary that we use materials that had good medicine in them. He told me to go to the beach and find 10 large clean oyster shells, indicating the number with the fingers of his 2 hands. When I came back with these, he examined them critically, one by one. Apparently they were satisfactory. Then he told me to clean them further with sand and fresh spring water. I did this. We then placed them on a large rock to dry in the sun. Joe said that while the shells were drying, I could begin to collect the clay that would be used. At a spring on the other side of Hunter Island, above the high tide line, we began to dig out handfuls of bluish-gray clay. This was the only clay, he said, that would dry correctly and not crack in the fire afterwards. We carried the clay back to Joe's camp on 2 slabs of elm tree bark. When we were back inside the campground, we sat down on the ground and squeezed the clay through our fingers until no pebbles or lumps remained. It was now of a very uniform consistency, but a bit on the wet side. Then the man explained the use of the oyster shells. While the clay stood to dry a bit, I took the shells to a flat stone and ground them up into a fine white powder. The rounded, flat mulling stone that Joe used to grind up his corn served very well, and soon I had a fairly large pile of shell dust. Joe examined the pile, and without a word, divided it in two. Half the pile he took and scattered around his vegetable plot. The other half he poured into my clay mixture. I sat and squeezed the powder into the clay, mixing the two into one. All the while I wondered about the part that had gone into the garden soil. Joe never spoke of it again, and I never asked. It was only years later that I decided I had ground some calcium to keep the soil sweet or non-acid. 5 shells would have been sufficient for my pot, but 5 would not have done a thing for Joe's tomatoes. At the time, I had considered 10 shells an invaluable step in the mystical making of a clay pot. Somehow, I'll never be sure that it wasn't. Everything had been done properly, he assured. The shell dust would give its medicine to the clay, making it stronger than it would have been alone. The mixture was clear of any foreign material, such as pebbles or twigs, and now it was ready to form into a pot. First, under the watchful eyes of my Indian mentor, I modeled a small, round, bowl-shaped base. I set this aside to dry and stiffen a bit, while I kneaded and rolled out small ropes of clay. I placed these, one next to another, on a smooth sheet of bark. Joe made sure that they were the proper thickness and length. Any that didn't measure up to his standards went back into the general mix to be rolled out again. He explained that each must be slightly longer and thinner than the previous one. This was what would make the pot grow from its thick-walled, narrow base to its thinner but wider rim. I went back to my base piece, then, and found that it had set sufficiently to serve as a foundation for my first coil of clay rope. I laid the roll around the periphery of the base piece and carefully pinched the 2 ends together. With the dabbing on of a bit of wetter clay, the joint was soon invisible. We added 2 or 3 more coils in the same way, and then he said we would wait and let this part set so the pot to be would not slump and cave in from its own weight. After an hour in the warm, dry air, the first portion of my vessel had dried sufficiently to take the weight of more clay coils. I added the next group, trying not to let my excitement take away from the careful work that the man kept reminding me to do. That wasn't easy, for I could now see the beginnings of a recognizable form. It wasn't a pot yet by any means, but it was far from a mixture of clay and oyster shell dust. I repeated the routine at intervals during the remaining daylight. By the time the shadows were long and the whippoorwills had started their mournful song, I saw that the pot would not be finished that day. We covered the still damp form with wet leaves to keep it from drying too fast. If that should occur, he told me, further coils would not stick well, and the whole pot would crack when we placed it in fire to harden. I went home and told my parents about the pot at supper that night. I remember that my mother didn't seem too impressed. She said she could remember stories of people making such pots of clay in her native Russia, but that it didn't seem to be necessary in this new country where everyone could buy a metal pot at any good houseware shop. My father was a bit more receptive, since he, as I, was very interested in the past of his new homeland. It was he, I suppose, who had first started me off on my natural history investigations. He didn't want me to become overly preoccupied with impractical matters, however, and his next statement showed it. He told me it was good that I had interesting ways to spend my vacations, but to keep in mind I would soon be big enough to spend them with him, learning the ironworker's trade. I thought this would be fine later on, but all I could think of now was the unfinished clay under leaves at Hunter Island. The night seemed to pass more slowly than most. Next day I greeted sunrise with Joe. We both held cups of the therapeutic tea and watched a new day wink over the eastern horizon. Now, said the Indian, that the Maker had given us the light to see by, we could resume our work. We uncovered the damp clay and placed it on the work surface of smooth stone. I was caught by the idea that it was beginning to look very much like an egg with the blunt end cut off. It was not a smooth egg, though. Each new coil of clay had produced a ridge, and now I looked at a corrugated, egg-shaped item. Joe said not to worry. Once I placed the final few coils in their positions, he would show me how to smooth the pot. I added the last clay pieces, and the pot now stood about 18 inches high. It was roughly 12 inches across at the top, and tapered to a roundish point at the bottom. Now we took the remaining clay and mixed in more spring water, bringing it to a pasty consistency. Using the palms of both hands, I smoothed this into the corrugations on the sides of my pot. Soon all were filled, and by gently stroking the excess away, I obtained an uninterrupted curvature from base to lip. The old man said now was the time to add the decorative marks that would make the pot pleasing to the eye. Other medicine marks would need to be etched in after the pot had begun to harden. The decorations were only for people's eyes, but the later marks would be for the spirits. If they found these marks pleasing, the pot would serve its owner well. We took a flat piece of wood and wound bark cord around it until the wood was covered with a tight wrapping. We pressed this into the still damp clay, producing a pattern of wavy lines that was intricate and yet uncomplicated. The idea was simplicity itself, but the result, as Joe had predicted, was pleasing to the eye. Now, he said, we must be very careful to dry the pot properly. It must dry from the inside out for its first stage. We both placed damp grass around the outside and left the inside empty, then left it that way for a long time. When later he tested it with his fingers for the third or fourth time, Joe said we could now carve in the magical marks his parents had taught him. In later years, my study of archaeology showed me that Joe's parents had not been the first of his ancestors to use these medicine markings on their pottery. In technical terms, the etching I did that day with a small pointed chip of flint is called Bowman's Brook, type incising. Its use is dated as being about 1,000 to 2,000 years old by today's archaeologists. Next, we filled the pot with damp leaves and grass. It stayed filled overnight. This allowed the moisture to be forced out through the now drying clay. In the morning, we took away all the grass and leaves and left the pot to sun-dry. Then we left it again overnight. The next day, after the morning dew had been burnt away by sun, Joe pronounced the time for building the fire. This done, with small chunks of dry oak wood, we let it burn down to embers. The pot was placed among these, and we watched as the last moisture was driven off in a fine mist of water vapor. We added new charcoal during the day, but only enough to replace that which was reduced to whitish ash. Late afternoon had come when we let the final embers die and cool off. It was important that the pot cool slowly so it would not crack now and ruin all our efforts. The new vessel didn't crack, and just at sundown, Joe said it was ready. We carefully lifted the pot from its bed of ashes. It was still quite hot to the touch, but Joe said this was good, for we still had one step to perform. Now we must make it waterproof. If we did not perform this last process, it would never be any good for cooking use. The water and heat would soften the clay and make it porous. While the original fire had been cooling, Joe built a small bed of oak chip embers. I had thought he intended to cook over the second fire. He now took several handfuls of crushed corn cob and scattered them into the tiny flames. Soon a very thick cloud of smoke was rising from the burning cobs. We inverted the pot over the small pile and let it to smoke inside. Only nearly invisible wisps that escaped under the rim gave any indication of the contained smudge fire. While the corn smoke did its mysterious job, we shared cups of the now familiar tea. Since the leaves had begun to fall, Joe was adding the crushed ends of sassafras twigs to his brew. These ends held the baby buds, which would bring the new leaves to the trees after winter. I don't know whether the addition of the buds did it or not, but the stuff was beginning to taste good. He explained that depending on the season, there were always different types of illness to be guarded against. It was fortunate that the maker had provided the appropriate remedies for each time of the year. It was no accident that the spring brought new, soft shoots from the sleeping skunk cabbages and fresh buds from the slippery elms. The new roots of the jack-in-the-pulpit plant were also important. The early cattail stalks with hard green fruits were very useful too. By the time summer was in full force, the leaves of certain trees and plants were to be picked and dried for the coming winter. These must be collected at the right time so they would be most potent. At this season, the seeds must be taken from green apples, for they played an important role in sickness prevention. The pits of peaches and wild plums were to be saved. When autumn colored the green leaves yellow and orange, it was time to begin collecting all sorts of herbs, leaves, roots, and berries, for soon there would be no more. In winter there were still items such as the sleeping buds from many species of trees that could be gathered, but these could not provide all the needed ingredients. If one had not prepared for winter, it was very possible that he might never see spring. Winter, he said, was the resting time, the time when the Maker had decreed most things should sleep. The bear went into her cave, not to emerge until the warming gusts told her it was time to give birth to cubs. The leaves fell, the green went away, and even the roots slept. Winter was the time to have all things near one, as did Hannock the squirrel. The Maker had ordained that the rabbit and some other game should still be available, but these were only the means to provide a little extra food. What was in the wigwam when the snow began to fall was generally all one could really depend upon. Joe's discourse on remedies and roots, seasons, and especially winter, brought all sorts of questions to my young mind. I knew certain things after several years of Boy Scout training, and I decided to ask about the conflicting ideas. I asked Joe why he spoke of bears when anyone knew that there were no bears here to sleep their winters away. He agreed that the bears were all gone now. He said, a bit sadly, that there had been bears here once, though. The Maker had always seen to it that there were bears in the old time. Kona, the bear, was a very important animal to Joe's people. The skin of Kona was the finest blanket that a brave could provide for his family. This skin would make it possible for them to sleep in the wigwam, even if, by chance, the heating fire should die on a cold winter night. The teeth of the great bear were a medicine thing that would protect the bear's hunter as long as he wore them. The fat of the great animal was used in cooking and as a salve against insect bites or sunburn. It was even possible for a young Indian to enter the state of manhood in the eyes of his father and his tribe by hunting and killing the bear. In the old time, the skull of the bear had always been saved after the kill, It was cleaned and then painted. The totem object, for that is what it was, full of medicine, was placed on a stick near the home. By doing this, the hunter was protecting his family from enemies, hunger, and sickness. Yes, he said, the bear was surely a part of the great plan the Maker had used in providing for his people. The bear was not angry with the hunter who was finally able to slay him. He knew that he had been sent here to be of use to an Indian family. He required only that his killer be brave and worthy. If the hunter was not, the bear was triumphant. It was in this way, among others, that the Maker had tested his children. I asked him why, if the bears were important, were there none here anymore? His answer, sad in itself, has always stayed in my mind as a symbol of great loss. The bear is gone now, Joe Two Trees said, because the Maker must feel no one is left who could respect him. None of his people need a blanket to warm them. None are worthy enough to wear the great teeth around their necks. None are left. I reminded him that he was still here, and the Maker must surely take that fact into account in his great plan. He answered in a very solemn tone and posture. His reply made me hope that I would not someday be given the distinction of being the last of my kind. The Maker has forgotten me. All of the people are no more, and only I am left here for a little while. Although I tried to learn the proper ways, it was already too late in the time of my father and mother. I am not Indian anymore. I am not white man. I am not worthy enough to hunt the bear. The Maker has forgotten me. Long ago he gave me a bear, but he took it from me later on. That once I was an Indian again. We sipped our tea for a long while in the silence of falling dusk. After a time we looked at the inverted pot, and Joe said the smoke fire still had to burn underneath. I decided to leave and return in the morning. The sky was struck with colors of gold, purple, red, and ochre as I walked my path toward Throg's Neck. The crickets had begun to count the passing seconds with their chirp. The air was very clean and quiet. I found it hard to believe that Teaching Manitou had forgotten Joe Two Trees. The morning finally came. When the other members of my family were still sleeping soundly, I gathered a few things and headed for my new pot and my new friend. The walk seemed endless, and I imagined that the clay had cracked. I was sure that the whole thing had been too simple. I would find a crumble of burnt clay over a pile of burnt corn cobs. The Maker could never place his sanction on the efforts of a young white boy. I arrived in the campsite at the hour when darkness and light are still fighting to see which should prevail. I thought it was too early, and that the Indian might still be sleeping behind his bark walls. As I stood, trying to decide if I should wake him, I became aware of his presence behind me. I turned, and he was there. I remember thinking quite often that it was not possible for a man to move as silently as he. I was often surprised like that, and I am sure it was usually unintended. The man asked if I would share his breakfast. Since I had left home so early, I was hungry. I asked if we could examine my pot, but he replied that the light was not good yet for such critical things, and so we ate. Joe had not expected my company, and had prepared a meal for himself alone. He brought out an extra plate and poured some ground corn porridge into it. Next, he scraped a dark mixture of sun-dried raisins, crushed hickory nuts, and tiny pieces of diced smoked meat over the hot corn. The mixture was every bit as good as any breakfast I had ever eaten at home. He told me his name for the dried mixture, but over the years I've forgotten. I have read, though, that Indians made such a mix to bring along on hunting trips. It was light in weight, nutritious, and easy to carry in a small pouch. It is called pemmican. This may also have been the Indian name I heard that day. We finished our meal, and by then the sun had beaten back the darkness. He said we could examine the clay piece now. We picked it up, and he tapped it firmly with a small stick. He struck it on each side as he rotated it with one hand. This was to be sure it had no cracks or imperfections. If each tap had not had the proper sound, it would have indicated a flaw. To my great relief, each strike rang true. I examined our creation, inside and out. The interior walls were coated with a moist black covering. I rubbed at it and found that although the color came off on my fingers, the clay was permanently impregnated. Smoke from the corn cobs had gone into the material itself, and it was what now made the pot waterproof. I ran to the nearby spring and washed the soot and ash from the new utensil. When it was clean, I filled it with water and set it in some grass. I wanted to test it and see for myself that water would not turn it back into soft clay. Joe, who had been watching me, laughed. He said I could trust this new pot because it had been made in the old way.